The Hittite Empire. Wind cuts across the Anatolian plateau, broken stones, silent ruins. For generations, historians insisted the Hittites were a biblical exaggeration, a nation that never existed outside ancient text. The Bible spoke of them like neighbors, traders, even military rivals, but no empire leaves footprints without leaving records. And then archaeologists uncovered a buried capital filled with royal archives, treaties, and military dispatches carved into clay. The silence shattered. What critics called myth turned into a sprawling civilization with influence across the ancient world. The Bible wasn't referencing folklore. It was describing a real power. Genesis presents Abraham negotiating land with Hittite authorities like seasoned diplomats, not fictional characters. That tone matters. It assumes a recognized political structure. Centuries later, 2 Kings describes alliances involving Hittite kings. Notice the pattern. The text never pauses to explain who they are. It treats them as common knowledge. That confidence looked suspicious to skeptics until the tablets surfaced. Suddenly, the geopolitical landscape of Scripture matched the archaeological map line for line. What sounded like narrative convenience revealed itself as historical memory preserved inside the text. The turning point came when the capital at Hadassah yielded thousands of documents detailing laws, royal lineages, and international treaties. This was not a minor tribe. It was a structured empire with administrative sophistication rivaling Egypt. The Bible's casual references suddenly felt precise. What critics labeled invention became confirmation. The narrative never needed rewriting because it never needed defending. The evidence arrived centuries later like a delayed verdict handed down by history itself. They didn't invent a nation to support the story. They recorded a nation history had temporarily forgotten. Scripture never needed archaeology to be true. Archaeology just eventually caught up. The Merneptah stele. A black granite slab stands in a museum case carved with the boast of an Egyptian pharaoh. Victory lists, conquests, dominance declarations meant to intimidate enemies and immortalize power. And then one line appears almost casually, buried among defeated nations. The name Israel. Not a city, not a territory, a people. This inscription predates most external references by centuries. Egypt was documenting Israel as an established group long before many critics believed they even existed. The stone wasn't trying to prove the Bible right, it was trying to celebrate conquest. And in doing so, it accidentally confirmed a nation. The Bible describes Israel emerging as a distinct people during a volatile regional power struggle. That claim sounded convenient to skeptics who argued the identity developed much later. But the Merneptah inscription dates to the late 13th century BC and lists Israel among known populations. Notice the phrasing. The hieroglyphic marker identifies them as a people group, not a land. That distinction matters. Egypt wasn't describing territory. It was acknowledging a living population with social cohesion strong enough to be recognized by a global empire. The discovery shifted the timeline conversation overnight. Israel wasn't a late invention or a retroactive national identity. Egypt's own propaganda confirmed their existence in the historical window Scripture describes. The stele was not written to validate biblical narrative, yet it aligned with it precisely. That kind of accidental corroboration carries weight. The empire trying to erase enemies ended up preserving their memory in stone. History sometimes records more truth than the writer intended. They tried to memorialize victory. Instead, they documented survival. Empires carve monuments to their power. But sometimes those monuments become evidence for the people they tried to erase. If that realization hits you with fresh weight, type "History Speaks" in the comments. The Cyrus cylinder. Inside a museum display sits a clay cylinder covered in royal inscriptions. At first glance, it looks like standard imperial propaganda, a Persian king announcing his greatness, his victories, his policies. But among those proclamations is a policy of returning displaced peoples to their homelands and restoring their temples. That policy echoes a moment recorded in biblical narrative when exiled communities were allowed to return and rebuild. The artifact isn't quoting Scripture, it's describing a governing philosophy that aligns with one of the most pivotal turning points in Jewish history. The book of Ezra records a royal decree allowing the exiles to return and rebuild the temple. Critics once framed that account as theological storytelling rather than political reality. But the cylinder reveals Cyrus had a documented pattern of repatriation and religious restoration across his empire. Notice the strategy. This was not random mercy, it was statecraft. Stabilize conquered regions by restoring local identity and worship. That policy matches the biblical narrative's timing and tone with remarkable precision. When historians translated the inscription, it reframed the exile narrative as a geopolitical decision rather than a mythic flourish. The return wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was imperial policy applied to multiple cultures, including the Jewish people. The Bible recorded the human side of that decree. The cylinder preserved the administrative side. Two perspectives, one event. The convergence tightened the historical framework around one of the most defining moments in Jewish restoration. The decree wasn't invented to fit prophecy. Prophecy unfolded through a king who thought he was just governing wisely. History doesn't always recognize divine timing when it writes policy. Hezekiah's tunnel and the Siloam inscription. Torches flicker inside a narrow, rock tunnel beneath Jerusalem. The air is damp. Footsteps echo against chiseled stone. Two teams of workers are digging from opposite directions through solid bedrock, racing against time while an enemy army advances. This was not a construction project for convenience. It was a survival operation. When archaeologists uncovered the ancient inscription carved into the tunnel wall, it described the moment the two crews finally heard each other's voices through the rock. The relief, the urgency, the breakthrough. A city preparing for siege left its story etched underground. The Bible recounts King Hezekiah securing Jerusalem's water supply ahead of an Assyrian invasion. That move reads like strategic foresight, but the tunnel proves the engineering feat was real and monumental. Notice the detail. The inscription doesn't speak like legend. It records measurements, the meeting point, and the moment water flowed. This was wartime infrastructure, a defensive measure against a global superpower. The text and the tunnel tell the same story from two angles, one theological, one operational. When explorers mapped the passage, its path matched the timeline of Hezekiah's preparations exactly. The engineering complexity revealed a city mobilizing under threat, not a symbolic narrative flourish. What Scripture described as faith under pressure also involved logistical precision. The convergence between text and stone transformed a king's decision from literary anecdote into documented history carved beneath the city itself. They didn't just pray for protection, they carved it through bedrock. Faith didn't replace strategy, it directed it. Dead Sea Scrolls. A shepherd throws a stone into a cave and hears pottery shatter. Inside the jars lie ancient scrolls wrapped in linen preserved in desert dryness for nearly 2,000 years. The moment those fragments were unrolled, the timeline of biblical preservation shifted overnight. These texts predated previously known manuscripts by centuries, yet the wording aligned with astonishing precision. What critics expected to be a patchwork of evolving stories turned out to be remarkably consistent. The desert had been guarding a textual time capsule, waiting for the right moment to surface. Before this discovery, skeptics argued the Bible's text had been altered beyond recognition through centuries of copying. But the scrolls revealed a transmission process far more stable than assumed. Notice the implications. Entire passages mirrored later manuscripts with only minor spelling variations. That level of consistency across centuries is not accidental. It indicates a culture of preservation so meticulous that the message survived political upheaval, exile, and empire shifts intact. The discovery forced a recalibration of assumptions about textual reliability. The scrolls didn't just add historical curiosity, they reinforced the continuity of Scripture across time. The gap between ancient authors and modern readers suddenly felt narrower. What many assumed was a long chain of distortions revealed itself as a disciplined process of faithful transmission preserved through generations. Truth didn't erode with time, it endured through it. History doesn't always rewrite sacred text. Sometimes it just confirms how carefully it was carried. Tel Dan stele, House of David inscription. Fragments of a victory monument emerge from the soil of northern Israel. Aramaic script, broken lines. But one phrase stands out with startling clarity: House of David. For decades, critics insisted King David was a literary symbol, not a historical ruler. Then this inscription surfaced, written by an enemy king boasting of military triumph. The reference was not devotional, it was political. And that makes it powerful. Enemies do not validate myths, they document rivals. The stone spoke with the blunt honesty of conquest propaganda, and in doing so, confirmed a dynasty. Scripture presents David as a foundational king whose lineage shaped Israel's national identity. That claim was dismissed as royal legend until the stele entered the conversation. Notice the context. The inscription references a ruling house named after David, implying a recognized dynasty significant enough to be targeted in war. That kind of recognition doesn't emerge from folklore. It reflects geopolitical reality acknowledged beyond Israel's borders. Once translated, the stele shifted the debate from whether David existed to how influential his dynasty truly was. The Bible's portrayal of a royal lineage now had external corroboration carved into enemy stone. The convergence between narrative and artifact reframed David not as symbolic heroism, but as historical leadership remembered even by adversaries. They didn't carve his name to honor him. They carved it because they couldn't ignore him. You don't defeat a legend on a battlefield, you confront a kingdom. If that reframed the story. For you, leave the word validated in the comments. Nazareth archaeological evidence. A quiet hillside. Stone foundations barely visible beneath layers of soil. For centuries, critics claimed Nazareth was too small, too insignificant, or simply non-existent during the early 1st century. They argued the hometown of Jesus was a narrative convenience, a setting created after the fact. But beneath the modern town, excavations revealed domestic dwellings, storage pits, and burial sites dating precisely to the era described in the Gospels. This was not a mythic backdrop, it was a living village. Modest, rural. Exactly the kind of place the story describes without embellishment or grandeur. The Gospels reference Nazareth without explanation, assuming readers would recognize it as a real location. That confidence mattered. A fabricated setting usually carries dramatic description or symbolic weight, again, but Nazareth is mentioned with ordinary familiarity. Notice the tone. It's never romanticized, it's simply home. Archaeological layers confirmed a small agricultural community with limited population, matching the understated portrayal found in the text. The setting wasn't designed to impress. It reflected everyday life in a forgotten corner of Galilee. As discoveries accumulated, the narrative shifted from skepticism to recognition. Nazareth's existence during Jesus' lifetime was no longer speculative. The village's scale and character aligned with the biblical portrait so closely that it reinforced the realism of the gospel accounts. The story wasn't placed in a mythical landscape. It unfolded in an ordinary village whose very obscurity became part of its authenticity. They didn't invent a town to elevate the story. The story elevated a town history almost overlooked. Truth doesn't need a grand stage, it just needs a place to stand. The Pool of Bethesda. Stone steps descend into a series of large pools beneath the city of Jerusalem. For Years, critics dismissed the gospel description of this place as symbolic storytelling because no such structure had been identified. The text described 5 covered colonnades, an oddly specific detail that sounded literary rather than architectural. Then excavations uncovered a complex pool system with precisely those features. The layout matched the narrative with unsettling accuracy. The scene once labeled fictional suddenly became geographically tangible, a location you could walk through. John's Gospel places a healing at this pool, describing its structure without fanfare. That specificity matters. Notice how the account mentions the number of colonnades without explaining why, as if the reader already knew the place. That detail once seemed unnecessary until the excavation revealed the exact configuration. The text wasn't embellishing, it was remembering. The physical layout confirmed that the writer was describing a real location embedded in the city's landscape. Archaeologists mapped the site. The convergence between text and terrain became undeniable. The Gospel's descriptive precision transformed from literary curiosity into eyewitness texture. What critics called symbolic storytelling revealed itself as grounded narrative rooted in an identifiable place. The pool didn't just validate geography, it validated the realism embedded within the Gospel's quiet details. They thought the story borrowed a setting. The setting proved the story was anchored. If this realization sharpened your perspective, comment, "Eyes opened" below. Pontius Pilate. Inscription, a weathered stone slab surfaces in the ruins of a Roman administrative center along the Mediterranean coast. Latin letters, formal titles. And then the name appears, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. For generations, skeptics claimed the Roman governor mentioned in the crucifixion narrative lacked independent historical confirmation. The gospel accounts placed him at the center of the most consequential trial in history, yet outside sources seemed silent. This inscription changed that. It was not a religious artifact, it was an official dedication carved for imperial administration. The Gospels depict Pilate as the Roman authority overseeing the execution of Jesus, navigating political pressure in a volatile province. Notice the inscription's language. It confirms his title and jurisdiction, anchoring the narrative in documented governance rather than symbolic storytelling. This was a real official operating within Rome's provincial system. The convergence between text and inscription closed the gap between theological narrative and political history. Once authenticated, the artifact reframed the conversation about the trial's historical context. The figure once questioned now stood verified in stone, reinforcing the administrative framework surrounding the crucifixion account. The narrative wasn't unfolding in a vacuum, it was embedded within the machinery of Roman governance where decisions carried legal authority and geopolitical consequence. They didn't invent a governor to tell a story. A governor's inscription confirmed the story's setting. If that confirmation stirred something deeper, comment standing firm below, Caiaphas ossuary. A limestone burial box rests under museum lights, its surface inscribed with a name that echoes through the Passion narrative, Joseph, son of Caiaphas. Inside were human remains, and outside was the title linked to the high priest who presided over the trial of Jesus. This wasn't a symbolic relic, it was a family burial container from the exact era described in the Gospels. The discovery brought the inner circle of the crucifixion story into physical proximity, collapsing the distance between text and history. The Gospel accounts portray Caiaphas as the high priest orchestrating the religious proceedings against Jesus. Notice how the ossuary's inscription connects directly to that leadership lineage. This was not a random namesake. The timing, status, and burial style align with the elite priestly class of first-century Jerusalem. The narrative's central figure in the trial now had a tangible footprint, preserved in stone rather than parchment. The emotional weight of the discovery lies in its intimacy. Unlike imperial inscriptions or national monuments, this was a personal artifact tied to a household. The trial of Jesus was not just a theological moment. It involved real families, real leaders, and real decisions recorded in history. The ossuary anchors the passion narrative in the lived reality of Jerusalem's ruling class. They didn't stage a trial in legend. They preserved the legacy in stone. If this moment reframes the story for you, tell us in the comments which discovery felt the most undeniable. Truth has a pattern. It survives doubt. It outlives dismissal, and it surfaces when the time is right. Each discovery peeled back another layer of skepticism, revealing a consistent thread between ancient text and material history. These confirmations were never orchestrated to convince modern audiences. They emerged independently, scattered across deserts, ruins, and museum archives, yet converging on the same narrative foundation. The deeper you look, the clearer the pattern becomes. What sounded improbable keeps intersecting with physical evidence. Wild conspiracies didn't collapse under scrutiny. They hardened into history, exactly where the text said they would. If this changed how you see biblical history, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to catch what most people read right past, subscribe. We do this every week, or leave a comment with a topic you want us to uncover next.